to this topic of the day, Democratic Universalism. A subject I think a lot of these candidates embody if they don't even identify it with themselves. I kind of see similarities with them where it made me really comfortable to be able to endorse them. The basic philosophy is first, what is democracy really? Democracy is first a form of government in which common people hold political power. And that's really what we're centered on here at the Hill of Roses. It's people of every ilk, common folk across this country have power and should have a say in how their environment is being used. And now it can be ruled either directly, basically us picking out what policies we want done and then voting on it as a collective, or through elected representatives. Personally, I see a little bit of a mixture here. I do think that we should have both forms of government, but they should be for different things. For instance, I think a lot of our general policy that is not reflective of constitutional rights should be done through direct democracy in a lot of cases. I think we should be having more of these ballot initiatives that you've been seeing state to state. And I think that's really important because it gives you something on the ballot that you can trust that you're having a direct impact on. You know, when we're voting for these representatives, we don't have this trust that things are going to get better. We feel this gridlock in our country that nothing's getting done. And we have so many big, important things that we want addressed. And I think the American people are wise, but the political game is very conniving and deceiving, and they don't give you a lot of options because, first and foremost, these are private groups that get to control the rules, that get to control the access to longtime experienced members and donors within the party. There's a lot of controls that kind of confine a candidate into this bubble of falling in line. And I think sometimes you have to break through the noise directly and go with just a straight, direct democracy. But other times, when it comes to our constitutional rights, the things that government should not be able to infringe on, that is something that we need to make sure is handled in representative hands and go through the necessary, basically balancing points of needing a supermajority to actually make some change on that regard. So I think democracy at its core is supposed to be a representation of us. And I know for damn sure with what's happening right now, I'm not represented and you're not represented too. This is a rare exception where you have a couple people breaking through with a slightly progressive, more humanistic focus of this. But I think we all know that we're not getting a good say because currently we're being drowned out in speech by money and these corporate interests that are really having a sway on the majority of both Democrats as well as Republicans. So I think democracy needs to be a revitalization where we can trust our institutions again to represent us. Because if we're not being represented, we're going to be drowned out in our interests. We're going to see them trying to reopen economies when we know that there's a human death toll to be paid with that. And I think that's really important that we have some common say for everyday folk. That is who our stakeholders need to be as a nation, not these businesses. They are there for their own gains if they can, but it should be at no expense of our quality of life. That is where I think our real economic value lies. So our next philosophy kind of dives into that idea. It's really at its core, peace, liberty, and justice for all. You know, peace is freedom from disturbance and tranquility. It's not really just the idea of not being at war, even though the frequency of our war means we've been very rarely at peace in that regard as well. The real meaning of peace is freedom from disturbance, peace of mind, peace of health. Peace is the idea that you can live a life that you can pursue to its fullest. Peace is where you have this freedom of knowing that you're going to be all right. That is a real tranquility sense. The next is liberty. Liberty is really the act of being free. You know, we want to help people see this universal commonality. But if you believe that this is infringing on your rights, you should have every freedom to challenge that existing status quo and speak up. You should not be oppressed by like violent restrictions. I think a lot of the ways we've been handling these instances where people have been gathering, though, is completely wrong in the recent news of how we've handled coronavirus. Throwing people in jail while we release other people from jail in order to try and prevent this coronavirus makes no sense to me. I think we need to be being much more diplomatic and civic in these forms of being, you know, essentially a liberal democracy in a lot of ways. We need to have that freedom where we can control our own destiny. We need to just be able to say there's a baseline. We're not going to let you fall below this. We're not going to let you infringe on other people's liberties as well. I think that's a really important aspect of living in a real democratic society. We all should be able to speak our minds freely. The next is we have to be fair and reasonable. This is basically justice. I think in a lot of cases, there are going to be gray lines, and we need to be able to set precedent. We need to be able to reassess precedent for the moment that we're actually in right now. And I think justice is an evolving concept. I think people don't need to be justified in some of the behaviors they've done in the past far ago. They are a completely different person now. But that doesn't mean you also hide it up and you bury someone's story. I think justice is paying fair homage to each side of this story, that people can change, that they did make mistakes, or there isn't enough evidence for us to crucify them. But at the same time, we need to have the basic justice of giving a fair process to people to be heard, to make sure that their side is actually being respected and that powerful interests can't just squash people with legitimate claims. So I think that's a really important aspect, that no person, regardless of income level or privilege in terms of their skin color, should be judged differently. We should have a fair system in place for us all. The next idea of democratic, universalism is, how do you come to this agreement? It's going to take a lot of work for us to find really what the universal consensus is and what do we actually put forward. And that takes hard work. And it takes, we're not always going to agree with each other. And so I think it's this concept of just having endless committee meetings. We need to be able to work through our differences collaboratively. Disagree where you disagree. We're going to do it respectfully and we're going to do it passionately too. Like, we're not going to back down from our sides, but we have to have some common decency of how we can have a fair conversation on things. But, also for these people where we generally disagree vehemently for a lot of different reasons, when they agree with you, don't shun them for that. Take that agreement. Take them to your side. You don't have to be flipping onto their side where you disagree, but you do need that basic idea of bipartisanship of saying, you know what, if you agree with me now, I'm going to pull you to my side. I don't care what your color is. I think that's immensely important in our democracy as we work with people where we can, and we try to persuade them when we can't. That's what the basic idea of representation is. Obviously, not everyone's going to agree, and we want this mixed opinions of how we best serve our people, because no one political ideology is going to have all of the answers that are needed. And so I understand this is going to be an evolving concept of democratic universalism too. I have seen an article in the past basically try to proclaim its failures, but I think that also needs to be redefined in how it's targeted too. It can be an evolving concept where stuff can improve. We've seen it fail with socialism at times, in essentially, more so the communism side of it in terms of the authoritarianism, but sometimes in terms of the economies of actually nationalizing industries that it shouldn't be. You look at Venezuela, there's sometimes you have to blame economic sanctions, but you also have to realize some of it is mismanagement of their own country. We did this at a very early episode. It was a lot in due because they, invested so heavily in just nationalizing the oil industry and growing its share of its general exports. It became very concentrated on a volatile good. And then it had very poor monetary policy in taking so much external debt on rather than producing internal debt. And so there were some flaws there in its just general running of its economy. Yes, obviously, it was exacerbated by some of our capitalist powers that have clearly been showing the breaking points in it when it faces a coronavirus crisis where you're now having 27 million people out of work and fewer getting their actual unemployment payments. These models are flawed. We need to keep reforming them. But I do believe we have to be honest with what the principles are and try and improve them upon the way when we actually have to deal with real life consequences when these models are tested. So I don't think this is the perfect thing, but that's where we got to agree. We have to work through these things together. The next idea that I really want to embrace in terms of democratic universalism is, we have to respect that there's an interdependency, this like web of all existence that is really between us. And I think that's a really important idea to understand that, your actions will affect mine and my actions are going to affect yours. And that when we have our actions together, that's everything that exists within the society. It is our collective actions that determine what our future is. And so we have to understand our impact on others and how we can affect others as well. So I think that's a really important aspect of democratic universalism, is you have to understand what your impact is of, taking this collective action. You can't just be so selfish for yourself when that's going to harm others that might in turn harm you later. I think that's a really bad approach in terms of philosophy, in politics, and just in life in general. We need one another. So I think that's really important. And it goes beyond, in a lot of cases, just human to human. It's this concept of we're connected with our planet as well, our resources, and as well other living beings on this planet. We're interconnected in ways that we need to recognize in terms of our environmental sustainability. So I think it's really important that we take a universal approach, try to keep expanding our knowledge, which is basically the next principle of democratic universalism is, constantly searching for truth and meaning. We have to respect the process of, truth gathering. I think all the time when we assert certain things are basic facts of life, things get tested over time and certain things prove to be untrue. But, we have to rely that we have the best probability guess now, and we can't, obviously know what's in the future all the time. We have to rely on the, trustworthy, as I said before, truth gathering processes. And that can be in science and that can be in journalism. We have to care more about the methodology in which stuff is collected rather than necessarily the results that we see and whether they conform to what we already believe or not. Because I think that's very commonly what we do in a lot of instances of our consumption of information. So I think we have to constantly challenge our own assumptions and really push forward this idea of constantly searching for the truth and kind of challenging yourself to say, do I really know what I know? And I think that's really important that we can all do, because we do fall into these traps of just wanting to be in a bubble because it's comfortable. And we don't have to be challenged on what we think and possibly admit to being wrong. I think that's a really important fact, that we really reassess if this is what the collective wants. Are they wrong? Or do I need to have a new perspective here? I'm not saying bend to your principles all the time, but you should be bending to the idea of reassessing your truths. Because I think anyone that says, I am the same person I was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, is fooling themselves. We all grow as people and we're not the same over time. And there's key moments in which we decide, was this truth I held beforehand really true today? So I think that's a really big aspect of democratic universalism as well. The next is, an idea kind of Yang spoke to a lot in his campaign. And I think this is really why I also identified with him is, basically detecting the inherent worth and dignity in every person. Our human value is not our economic value, and that we must, enable people to be all that they can be and intend to do no harm to others, seeking to do harm to you, me, and we. I think this is a really important concept of simply having the knowledge that we all are part of this puzzle, that interdependency beforehand, and that we all have our own worth in a way, and that we can't be deciding which worth is worth less, because that is a subjective opinion by any individual. No one is truly going to be able to place the value on a life, so we should be respecting all life equally. I think that is the best approach for a lot of cases. We can have instances of how we assess penalties between two stakeholders. It doesn't have to be on us all, but like in this idea of how our government enforces upon us, it should be at an equal standard of each life. So I think that's really important, that we recognize that every person has value and that we should respect that. The next is having just basic compassion. It's having and understanding what the pain value is to others. When you're doing a cost benefit analysis, a lot of the times it comes from this perspective of a very individualistic standard. And, I think that is perfectly fine when it comes to how we act as individuals in this society. But I believe when it comes to the way we govern, we need to have this perspective of not who our powerful stakeholders are, who will be benefiting as us. It's an act of service and compassion to be caring about the needs of your people and making sure that it might not always help you, because in fact, it's going to hurt most people that are currently in Congress. They are making loads of money right now. They have benefits out the wazoo. Most of them, as you can start to see, have a median income of $500,000 or more. Some of that's because they're old, but it's also the fact that they get benefited wildly and they get all these other external benefits that come with their job. So I just want that to be known, that we are clearly seeing a lack of sympathy for us all when they're not, actually acting on these clear-cut things that would help us in crisis mode. So I think having this basic compassion is an important value of democratic universalism. We have to consider the universal collective of stakeholders in our country at the time. And so I don't think we're doing that well now. And I hope we can actually embrace that just simple level of compassion for our fellow man and woman. The next is this more practical sense. In terms of universalism, we have to consider universal services versus mean tested one. I think it's very important that we consider these differences of approaches down to the level of administration, as well as how much are we actually even economically benefiting the bottom. We can always be readjusting these programs on a taxation side and how we raise our funds. But when we actually look at the net benefit between groups, when you do universal programs versus, means tested in terms of savings and net transfer of wealth, you're finding that these universal programs are much more efficient because you don't have to actually go through all of that administration, and the taxation balances out any redistribution problems in how the system is basically designed in terms of its base fund level or total amount. That's really important in terms of universal systems, is we also want to have everyone as the stakeholder in the success of those systems. This is one of the really important parts behind the argument that people like single payer healthcare in general, is because we all have to be stakeholders in it. We all have to assure it's this common value of quality, because even the rich are stakeholders in this. So they can't just skimp out on the poor and try and fight that program tooth and nail, because they are receivers of it as well. So I think that's a really important aspect, is, having some universality in this approach makes everyone, committed to the success of the program. It makes it a lot more politically viable because it's not a you versus me all the time. And I think that's really important. And the last thing is on the same idea of, how we manage our government in terms of, economics, especially. We need to have some democratic control over how we're taxed. I think that's one thing that we deserve as our representation in terms of how we got to this point of wanting to rebel and form our more, our better union, not perfect union, but our better union. And so I think having some control over how we administer taxation can do a big amount of help. So things like, do we want to do stuff with VAT? Do we want to be giving these tax exceptions? I think these need to have more common sense say from not the people in charge of giving, cutbacks to companies all the time. I think there should be some democratic equation to how we do taxation raises. And that's something that obviously is going to evolve over time. But if we can get to these more direct democratic, solutions, and we embrace, even democratic technology solutions, as like Heidi suggested before, as I covered here, I think that's going to really help us go a long way in having some say in how we fund things. Because I think we need to control how, not necessarily the level, but how we fund things, as well as we need to be saying what services at a base level do we want the government to provide. I think the representation comes into what rights we have as people and enforcing just like a judiciary system in general. But when it comes to the basic social programs and general spending by the government, I think there's a lot more that we as the people should be stakeholders in. And I know that's not exactly in the formation of the Constitution, as you can kind of see behind me, in terms of having a more representative public. But I have to say, one of the things that's really been important in the evolution of our country has always been the expansion of voting rights throughout it. Those are some of the biggest social movements of our ages. And I think every step of the way, we've been gaining some more power over our say in our democracy. It's not enough, though. It's certainly not enough. But you have to think about all the people who had no say whatsoever beforehand. Before, it was only property owners. Then it was all white people. All white men. Then it was, we added people of color into the mix to be able to vote. And then we finally got to women. We did it through stages. And then we've had it be into the Civil Rights Act. So we don't even have not being allowed, but having it be just as accessible to people. It's a constant expansion over time of being able to say, you get a say in what is happening in your nation. We're not there yet. Right now, we're fighting a very uphill battle in terms of money as a stakeholder from these very wealthy organizations and special interest groups compared to us, a rather apathetic and untrusting people of what government can do currently. So it's a really hard challenge, but I think it's something that we need to keep fighting for, because every time we get a say, our society does advance towards the better. Now, do we get every decision right by our collective? No, you could see Brexit being an example of that. But I think it's important that we still have a say. And I think we end up getting it right more often than our representation does currently, at least on the social services type of side and how we want to be spending our money into the government. I think that's a really important aspect that we control.